Before we start advecting our particles using the smoke, we will change one more thing to our sourcing. So this is the particle simulation so far. And this will work pretty well for what we are trying to achieve. But if we think about this for a second, this skull currently emits particles from all over its surface. So I will go inside this PopNet actually and just increase the particle count for now to better illustrate this idea. So this is how it looks on the first frame, and then it constantly emits particle from mostly all around the surface. So the noise will help break up the surface a little bit and generate more interesting shapes. And let's also template the geometry and maybe step a little bit inside Photoshop to maybe better illustrate this idea. So currently the particles are being generated from all over this area of the skull, but we don't really need to generate particles in the center of the face over here. So the particles are being generated here in the front of the face. These will now step backwards and create the trail, but they will be obscured by the particles that are generated on the sides of the skull. So we won't be seeing the particles that are being generated from the inside of this face because of this obscuration that occurs. So really we need to generate particles only from the silhouette of the skull. And let's see exactly what I mean inside of Houdini. I will drop down here a file cache node, and I want to cache this simulation as it is right now so we can compare later. And I'll set up a folder, and this will be body PRT for particles, and I'll leave this as version 1, and I will cache out 100 frames for this. So let's see, let's take a look at some frames, and this will be how our simulation is so far, and we can see that there are particles all up inside the trails here. Okay. So now we will make some changes to our source, and we will go inside this attribute VOP over here, and inside this node I want to use that dot product function that we talked about in the demonstration. So I will place the normal vector inside the dot product, and for my second input I will simply specify the vector over here, and the vector will be 0, 0, 1. So this will now point directly in the z-axis. And if I place this inside the CD attribute, now we can see that we mask everything that's behind my skull. And I will also place a ramp after the dot product, or rather a ramp parameter. Okay, and we need to set this to spline, and I will give this a name, so this will be dot_1. And if I go up a level, I will reset this ramp by holding Ctrl and middle mouse clicking the name. And now we can adjust these values a bit. Okay, so I'll just drag this over. And what I want to do is create the reverse of this effect, so the reverse of the dot product. So inside this attribute VOP I can go now, and I will simply grab this ramp and duplicate this over. And we have to give this a new name, so I'll just say ramp2, and this will be labeled dot_2, and I will simply now multiply these two ramps. So if I go up, let's set the first one to be the complement ramp. Okay, so now we can use the first one to sort of cut away the frontal part of our mesh, and we can use the second one to cut the back part of our mesh. And when we multiply these together, we can see that we end up with isolating exactly this area that we talked about, which will be the sort of the silhouette of the skull. Okay, and we can adjust these values a little bit. And now our particles will only be generating from the sides of the mesh. Let's go back inside this attribute VOP, and let's also add our noise back in as the third input for this multiply. Okay, and now when we go to our PopNet and simulate, we will actually go to our file cache and set this to be version 2, and then we can compare, so save to disk. Okay, so if we compare the versions now, we can see that while this simply has a lot more particles, this also looks like it fills up the entire trail. So I'll just go inside here and maybe increase the birth rate to 15,000 and let's resimulate this now. And let's resimulate this as version 2. So now we can see that even though these are now both 3 million particles, we can see that the second version is a lot more denser. And this is simply because we are no longer wasting these particles right here in the center, which are not going to be seen anyway because they are obscured by the particles that are generated from the sides. So while this frame right here doesn't look right compared to this one, this won't matter in our case because we will be simulating the head separately anyway. So as I go over here, we can kind of see the difference that this has this empty space over here inside the middle and this doesn't. So we are not wasting any computation power on these particles that are not going to be seen here in the center anyway. Okay, so if I go here, there's this empty space, but from the side this will look like it's a filled trail. So even though we don't have particles in the inside of the trail, because this will be rendered as a sort of thick smoke, it will seem like there's actually smoke inside the trail. So for now I'll just go back inside this PubNet and I will set the birth rate to maybe, let's set this back to 1500. So we will be working with 350 points for our next look development process.